Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Columbia River Keepers Love Your Columbia webinar series. For today's webinar, Environmental Justice and Public Health, the Columbia's newest Superfund site. My name is Lauren Goldberg. I'm actually stepping in today for my coworker who is out sick, and I'm very happy to be with you all. I actually started working at Riverkeeper about 17 years ago as a law clerk, and I'm honored to currently serve as the organization's executive director. Starting about 6 years ago, Columbia Riverkeeper began working in solidarity with Yakama Nation to hold the U.S. government accountable for decades of toxic pollution at one of the most popular fishing areas in the mid-Columbia. This is known as the Bradford Island and surrounding waters. During today's webinar, we will be digging into the history, treaty rights, environmental justice issues, and the public health risks in the area. And we really appreciate all of you taking your time to join us today and learn more about this really critical issue. I hope that today's webinar inspires you to speak up for environmental justice. I'll be sharing links in the chat during the webinar, and for those of you who RSVP'd, we'll also be sharing important ways for you to make a difference on this issue and take action. Before we get started, I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. We at Columbia Riverkeeper recognize the unique and enduring relationships that exist between Native people and their traditional territories. We respectfully acknowledge the places that we are joining from today rest on traditional lands of Native people who've cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial and continue to do so today. With that, for those of you who aren't familiar, the new Superfund site along the Columbia is less than 40 miles upriver from Portland, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington, near Bonneville Dam. As I mentioned, Columbia Riverkeeper worked in solidarity with Yakama Nation to first get the area added to the Superfund list, and that happened just over a year ago. And now to advocate for a thorough cleanup that engages tribal governments and tribal and non-tribal members that are impacted by the pollution. In addition to the Yakama Nation, 6 other tribes include Bradford Island and their traditional hunting and fishing grounds. Again, for those of you who aren't very familiar with the area and the Superfund list is reserved for the worst of the worst contaminated sites in the US. The Army Corps of Engineers, which is a federal government agency, caused the pollution and is responsible for the cleanup at Bradford Island. And with the Superfund listing, the Corps must comply with what's often referred to as the Superfund law. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which is often referred to as EPA, has the authority to review and to approve cleanup plans and enforce Superfund requirements. But as a first step, the Corps and EPA have to develop and sign what's called a Federal Facilities Agreement. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that in today's webinar because it's such a key legal document to really get this cleanup started. Today, we're fortunate to have experts, Yellowash Davis Washines and Phil Cordell, who are joining to talk about the history and cultural significance of the area, as well as updates on contamination and the cleanup itself. I'll be again sharing some links with you during the presentation. Would encourage all of you to learn more about Yakama Nation and the Yakama Nation Fisheries Program, which has been very central for many years in holding the government accountable for cleanup. I also want to acknowledge Columbia Riverkeeper's incredible supporters who donate to Riverkeeper, and by pooling their resources, they make our work possible. I know many of you who are joining today are Riverkeeper supporters, and I really appreciate that support. I also want to thank the East Multnomah County Soil and Water Conservation District, their partners in conservation program, as well as the Spirit Mountain Community Fund, which supports public education and engagement in this really critical environmental justice issue. And then just a couple of final reminders. We're going to try to leave time for question and answer at the end with our speakers. So as questions arise during the presentation, feel free to include those in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. And then, as I mentioned at the outset, we're recording the webinar, and we will be sending a follow-up email if you want to share it, as well as other resources. With that, I'm excited to kick off the webinar with a powerful video that was created by Yakama Nation and that will ground the discussion of Bradford Island and surrounding waters in the larger context of issues in the Columbia Basin. So just give me a moment here to work with our amazing communications wizards behind the screen to share this video with you.
They were created here truly and honestly.
It sounds like we were having a challenge with the audio, so I'll go ahead and drop the link in. It's a short video and would encourage you all to take a look at it if you haven't seen it yet. And if we have time at the end, we'll give it another try. With that, it is my honor to introduce a friend and mentor, Yellowash Davis Washines, who works as with the Yakama Nation Fisheries Program on Bradford Island cleanup and many other important issues to tribal government. Yellowash worked for over 30 years at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission and has a really impressive and storied career working for tribal governments in Critfic. And with that, I will pass it to Yellowash. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Next slide, please. So today we're going to be discussing the Bradford Island cleanup, and the title is the U.S. failure to protect the health and welfare of our Yakama Nation members. And I'll just do the kind of the little history of this area as the importance to our people. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the history of this land, we actually are also talking about the history of our people. And since the beginning of time, as the way, since time immemorial, we've had this sacred relationship with the resources, and most important, and one of the most important resources is our salmon. And it's also a big part in what we refer to as the genesis of our lands. And so in the beginning, the salmon were ones that in our belief stood up, and when the Creator was getting ready to for the people to come, and then so the salmon was the first one to say that I will sacrifice my body to be a food to the people. Next slide, please. Here you have a historical view of what the Bradford Island looked like, and all along what we call in Chihuahua, the big river, were villages, people on both sides. And as you see in the lower right-hand corner, we eventually these areas were displaced by what the term progress. And as you see, I believe those are railroad tracks and also some new homes being put in there. But this has always been, in spite of all the challenges, we still maintain this area as a part of what in the beginning. Next slide, please. In 2 weeks, we'll be commemorating the Yakama Nation Treaty with the United States from June 9th of 1855. And as you see on the map, this is a depiction of our treaty territories. Article 1 of the treaty that outlined, as you see in the gray, the lands that we ceded to the U.S. government, approximately over 22,000 square miles of Washington, approximately 1/3 of the state, in exchange for certain promises and certain guarantees that we still hold today. And these rights and guarantees were not given to us by the United States. These were rights that we have retained since the beginning of time, and we reserved them for future generations, our leaders at that time. You'll see the reservation depicted there in the dark. That's from Article 2 of our treaty. And these were all identified in the U.S. Yakama Treaty, part of our treaty territories. As you see, the larger tan is the Columbia River Basin. And also under Article 3, what the Supreme Court, in many cases, that we have had to rely on to secure what is called our usual and accustomed places. And certainly Bradford Island is a part of that usual and accustomed places that was guaranteed for our in perpetuity use in exchange for this 23,000 square miles of This kind of lets you know that what we have reserved for our rights. Next slide, please. Again, you have a comparison here of the way it was. Bradford Island, you'll see up in the upper left-hand corner, then current Oregon and Washington, and down below you'll see what it looked like after the Bonneville Dam had been constructed. So a great difference, as you can see. Next slide, please. Here we have a traditional platform or scaffold fishing. Again, these were platforms that were used at Bradford Island, but because of the risk that will be talked about by Phil, the tribal council had an emergency closure to any fishing off of Bradford Island. And this is a very highly unusual for the Yakama Nation tribal council to do this, but because of the risk to the health of our people, it was decided that not be allowed to fish on there. But even though they cannot platform fish off the island, we still have numerous scaffolds and platforms in the vicinity. And there is a in lieu fishing access site called North Bonneville, where our people still maintain a traditional way of living on the river and also fishing from these scaffolds along the river. So as you see, the gentleman there has caught a fish, and he could be taking it to one of our first food feasts, or he could be taking that food to his family or to an elder. So this, we consider this medicinal purposes, not only for nourishment, but also our spiritual connection to the salmon and our other first foods. Next slide, please. So here we have another early photograph. You see the family there. Maybe they're going to a feast or maybe going visit relatives, but you'll notice there are about 3 generations in this in this picture, and this is probably taken in the mid or around 1900. So these individuals have descendants among our people. And so the 14 Confederate tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation, our sacred relationship with the Columbia River is still being maintained to this day. We had an elder that when he explained it, what do you want our workers, our staff to do? And he said to make it the way it was and don't ever give up. And so you'll see the what our fisheries program has followed since is to honor, protect, and restore the Columbia River to sustain the cultural Yakama way of life, and not only for us, but for our neighbors and future generations. So these individuals you see, they are who they were, is who we are today, the Confederate Tribes of the Yakama Nation. At this time, I'll pass it off to Phil on some of the technical or other information. Thank you.
Yeah, and before Phil starts, Phil's joining us today. He's a consultant with Yakama Nation and is a licensed and registered geologist with more than 17 years of experience performing soil and sediment and groundwater site assessments, and also involving cleanup actions. He's managed projects throughout the Pacific Northwest, including Superfund sites along the Willamette River and large mine reclamation projects in remote areas of the Pacific Northwest. And much of his experience comes from working and supporting public entities and providing his unique perspective on really complicated regulatory processes. So we very much appreciate Phil's willingness to step in today and share with you all more of the technical information related to the new Superfund site along the Columbia. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lauren. Happy to be here. And Laura is very sorry she couldn't make it. She's dealing with a medical emergency. And I've been helping the Yakama Nation fisheries with this site since late 2022. So I've not been immersed in it as long as Laura, but I will do my best to fill some very big shoes. So next slide, please. Yeah, we wanted to start here because this really highlights why Yakama Nation is so concerned with this site. What you're looking at is a bar chart comparing PCB concentrations detected in fish tissue with Bradford Island, a sample collected from Bradford Island on the right from a small balanced bass in 2011. And then you'll see similar concentrations, and these are maximum concentrations, so the highest concentrations measured from 4 other high-profile Superfund sites in the country. You have the Hudson River in New York State, the Fox River in Wisconsin, and then our 2 local Superfund sites, the Lower Duwamish River in Seattle, and then Portland Harbor, which we're all familiar with. So PCB concentrations in fish tissue were measured at nearly 10x what they were in the Hudson River. And mind you that the PCBs are a primary contaminant of concern in these other Superfund sites as well. Generally, these Superfund sites have a mix of contaminants concerns, but PCBs are the primary driver at all of these Superfund sites. So we have 10 times higher levels than these other Superfund sites that have been studied for decades, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on remedial characterization and cleanup. Bradford Island, as you know, is just listed. And so we're very early in the RI and cleanup stages right now, but some work has been done, which we'll talk about. And then not only are we 10 times higher than these other sites, but you'll see the number highlighted on the right, the human health screening level of 0.57 parts per billion. So the concentrations measured in this smallmouth bass were over 300,000 times the human health consumption, 300,000 times the screening level that is recommended for human consumption of fish. And mind you that cleanup level is based on a fish consumption rate for the general population. Tribal fishers consume fish in this area at a much higher rate. So they're even more concerned because the screening level, they would advocate for is actually much lower than that 0.57 parts per billion. So next slide, please. So here you'll see an image of the site as it's configured today. You have Bradford Island in the middle, and that hatched area surrounding Bradford Island is the fish consumption advisory area. That was implemented in 2013, and that is a do not eat advisory. So as Yellowwash mentioned, tribal fishers have not been fishing this area for some time. Those tribal platforms are located relatively close to the site, just a quarter mile to a third of the mile upriver, well within this fish advisory area. And so Bradford Island sits in the middle here. And construction of the dam complex began in 1930s. And with that, shortly after that, in World War II, the complex expanded. There was actually an anti-aircraft battery at one point. They constructed a pistol and rifle range, as well as a landfill on the north side of Bradford Island. And that's where the story of this contamination begins. The site continued to be developed over the next decades. Some more powerhouses were built on the north side of the river, on the Washington side, and the locks on the Oregon side on the southern part of the dam complex were constructed in 1989, and they included removal of the northern part of Bradford Island and placement of that material at Goose Island. So the site has a long history extending back nearly 100 years. So we can go back to the next slide. And a little more on the history. So the initial contamination was discovered in 1996, and that was discovered during an investigation of the landfill I mentioned on the eastern part of the island. They quickly discovered that landfill material extended into the river, and multiple debris piles of electrical equipment were discovered. So that prompted some interim removal actions that began in 2000. I believe there were 3 actions that culminated in removal of several tons of electrical equipment and contaminated sediment. Yakama Nation was not informed of the site until 2005 and began advocating with, but they got little traction in those early stages. In 2011, more sampling was done following the removal actions, which during that sampling is when that 180,000 part per billion smallmouth bass PCB concentration was detected. And that prompted the fish advisory level. And that's been in place for nearly 10 years. It was implemented in 2013. So the Yakama Nation continued their advocacy, suing the corps for cost recovery in 2014 and working with Columbia River Keeper to get more action on the site, which eventually culminated in the site getting listed last year. And now it is the Northwest newest Superfund site. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned those removal actions back in the early 2000s, and these photos show you what they encountered next to the landfill area. There were 3 main debris piles. And so this equipment was just dumped into the river, decades ago. And some of this equipment was tested, and they found transformer oil as high, with PCB concentrations as high as 20%. So we're talking 200 million parts per billion. So you see these large capacitors and transformers that were found there. And not only were there PCBs, but a whole slew of metals and other contaminants that were associated with this material. So this material was excavated. The Yakama Nation actually didn't want this removal action to be completed initially because they wanted this area to be thoroughly studied so that we wouldn't be in a situation where we are nearly 2 decades later, continuing to study this area and figure out ways to improve the health of the river. Next slide, please. And here's a zoomed in view of Bradford Island. You're seeing PCB concentrations in sediment. The red areas denote higher concentrations, and the blue area lower concentrations. So these samples were collected after the removal action. were completed in the 2000s and show that contamination remains and is associated with these debris piles and outfalls, 1 and 2 you see to the east. So contamination remains. A series of studies have continued to be implemented by the Army Corps, but the magnitude and extent of the contamination is still not fully understood, and more characterization is needed and being discussed right now. Next slide, please. And so just to quickly review the key contaminants, I mentioned PCBs. There's also pesticides, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, metals, including mercury. And these are bioaccumulative compounds. So when the fish in the river, the bass and the migrating salmon eat these benthic invertebrates, they uptake the contaminants, and then they are consumed by fishers. And these bioaccumulative effects include wide-ranging symptoms, including nervous system, digestive system, immune system, reproductive, and neurobehavioral issues. And children and the elderly and immunocompromised people are particularly susceptible to these contaminations. And then the effects on the aquatic ecosystem include increased juvenile mortality, reduced adult survival, and decreased spawning success. So not only do we have the upstream human health effects, but the salmon and fish in this area have been infected, and those are threatened and endangered species. So it represents a huge concern to the Yakama Nation and the tribal fishers that this is addressed as soon as possible. Next slide. So I'll turn it back over to Yellow Wash.
Thank you, Phil. So let's go back to the spring of 2022. And as Phil indicated, this is when Bradford Island was what you call on the national priorities listing under the EPA. And I think most of you are familiar with the federal law that allowed this CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. So, but first of all, I want to thank not only for this webinar, but also for the one that we had earlier that we discussed this Bradford Island to Columbia Riverkeeper. And not only Columbia Riverkeeper, but a big thank you to all of our partners, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, Washington Ecology, community members, and those that help support getting the Bradford Island on the national priorities list. So that was a year ago. And so what next slide, please. So what are the advantages of being on the national priorities list? So there are several, and these are the main advantages that requires Environmental Protection Agency concurrence. It requires the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and EPA on certain important agreements. It's legally enforceable. There are ways to legally enforce this, and more, and it defines the work schedule as to how the cleanup will continue. And as was mentioned earlier by Phil, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had already began to remove some of the contaminants, but yet we, the Yakama Nation, we're not satisfied in the manner in which that was. So if we have a definite work schedule, that would go a long way to making sure that we have a complete and effective cleanup. And also, if there are any disputes, within the EPA listing, there is an established resolute process. So these are some of the advantages. And again, I want to thank all of our partners that helped us to get the national priorities list. The next slide, please. So on April 5th, 2022, the Yakama Tribal Council met with the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA in what is called a formal government-to-government meeting. And this is the manner that the Yakama Nation had wanted to meet with those responsible or those that had the authority to proceed with the cleanup process. And during that meeting, the Yakama Tribal Council made some specific requests during the government-to-government meeting back in April. And the first one was to have meaningfully engage the Yakama Nation in plans for cleanup. We have a Superfund office here that we're very familiar with the cleanup process, developing plans such as Portland Harbor. And so the Tribal Council wanted to make sure that our engineers, our people that are experts in cleaning up sites are fully involved. The second one was they wanted to prioritize and expand the cleanup. Now, understand this had been over 20 years that we were concerned about this contamination at the Bradford Island. So we wanted to quickly as possible, as quickly as effectively, to have an expedited cleanup. And that was the request, another request from our leaders. The third one was, again, to reestablish what is called a technical advisory group to review the proposed characterizations and the cleanup work. Again, these involve our experts, our technical experts, people that have a history of developing and reviewing and monitoring the cleanup operation. And the fourth request that our tribal council was to have an annual government-to-government meeting with the Yakama Nation leadership to update and assess the progress at the site. So these were the four specific requests that our tribal council, 14-member tribal council, had made to the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA back over a year ago, back in April. Next slide, please. So we're very, I guess, the engagement now more than ever, a year later, is worse than ever. And so the reason that we consider this is that in response over the past year, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, number one, they have performed no substantive work to clean up the site. Now, they may have done a few operations, but nothing that, really would make a great difference. Number two, they have cut the Yakama Nation out of the cleanup planning process and eliminated all communications. And so these are examples. They've disbanded the technical advisory group, which removes our tribal participation from the government team. And so that's, again, as I explained earlier, during our experts and our professionals that deal with toxic cleanup sites were completely removed from the technical advisory group. B, they stopped sharing information. We've had to go to great lengths to get information from the Army Corps of Engineers, to the extent that our attorneys have even had to file what is called Freedom of Information Act in order to get information as to what is going on there. And so we feel that, in any important cleanup, which involves the Yakama Nation, involves the federal agencies, involves the state of Oregon and Washington, there has to be complete transparency so that we know that, not only are the work is being done in an effective manner, but also, as I stated before, in our treaty, we are definitely concerned that, the reserved rights that we have to our usual and custom are either being diminished or totally ignored. So we find this stop of sharing information very, very critical. Number C, in an attempt to kind of placate the Yakama Nation, they have courted what is called the Restoration Advisory Board, or the RAB. And this is only open to any community member. And so, and we don't feel that, well, we don't deny any of our tribal members to participate in this community engagement, but this is not the official position of the Yakama Nation. And so there was this effort, when again, as our tribal leaders interpreted it as a means to limit our engagement as a sovereign nation. So, and number D, they have effectively removed the Yakama Nation out of what is called the Federal Facilities Agreement, or the FFA. And the FFA is a part of the CERCLA federal law. And this is the agreement between the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA, as EPA would monitor, and the Army Corps, they would manage it. But the Yakama Nation would have the ability to be involved, such as in the technical advisory group. And so this, the Federal Facilities Agreement is very, very critical on any national priorities list cleanup. And so the Tribal Council was adamant that that this is something that, we are involved in many cleanup sites, and this process, this is the only time that we've had encountered this type of resistance from the Army Corps of Engineers. So, and we want to state that those of you that are familiar with the Federal Facilities Agreement, Yakama Nation does not seek to be a signer of the agreement, but there are certain provisions in the FFA and in the cleanup site management plan that allow Yakama Nation participation. So I just want to make that clear. And also that leads into the third bullet point here of that they have stalled on the FFA process, specifically to trying to limit our involvement and our participation. Next slide, please. So what has the Army Corps done? And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has fulfilled only one of the requests that was made by our tribal council at the annual government-to-government meeting back in April. And so we had a follow-up, and that the only one that they followed up on was to have the annual meeting back on May 2nd of this year. So none of the other requests have been made. And so they've only fulfilled one promise, and that was to come back a year later. So, so after the tribal council met with the Army Corps and EPA, and we appreciate our partners also, Oregon and Washington, to have representatives there. So the Yakama Nation, we're not going to give up, and we will continue to push forward to have an effective and cleanup of the Bradford Island. So we have been meeting with some of the high-level officials at the Army Corps of Engineers, and we're encouraging the EPA to use any enforcement measures available. And we're very interested in discussions with the DOJ, Department of Justice and Planning for Litigation, as the Yakama Nation has filed what is called a Notice of Intent, the NOI, to sue the Army Corps of Engineers in Oregon Federal District Court. And again, as the timeline, this is the second time we've had to take the Army Corps of Engineers to Federal District Court to enforce what we believe is our reserve treaty rights in maintaining what what is happening on our usual and the custom area. And so that has been done, authorized by our tribal council. Next slide, please. I'll go back one. Sorry. So why did the Yakama Nation issue a notice of intent? Number one, we feel that the notice of intent to sue will trigger the U.S. Department of Justice involvement in getting this to hold the Army Corps of Engineers accountable. And for as they have been since the government to government meeting last year, and under the request of the Yakama Nation, have deliberately, for some reason, not wanting to include the Yakama Nation on any involvement. And so the rationale that we used was that there was a incomplete site characterization. This goes a lot to the technical information, the assessments there. And so we feel that they have not done a very complete site characterization of all the contaminants. And also there was an inadequate risk assessment, for example, the tribal risk, as Phil had indicated. Members of the Yakama Nation consume salmon and other species at a higher rate than the general public. And so there hasn't been an adequate risk assessment as to how it affects our tribal members. And number C is that the Corps clearly disregarded the states of Oregon and Washington state cleanup regulations. Again, these are requirements that are contained in the CERCLA law. And so when these site cleanup regulations, they cannot be less than the federal government. They can be more than the federal government's requirements. And so we come to understand that they are total disregard of Oregon and Washington regulations. Under D is the failure to enter into a federal facilities agreement within the prescribed 180 days as contained in the CERCLA, and the filing and having Bradford Island listed as on the national priorities list. And more importantly, the Corps has failed to recognize the Yakama Nation as a participating government. And again, we rely on the promises that were made to us 168 years ago when we negotiated a treaty with the United States. And as a federal agency, the Army Corps of Engineers comes under various executive orders, starting with President Clinton, and even the current administration has reiterated that those tribal relations contain efforts by federal agencies, which the Corps is, to have meaningful engagement, to have meaningful discussion. And so we feel that, the Yakama Nation, we are very strong that we will not let our treaty reserved rights be threatened, diminished, or ignored. And in this case, up to now, we feel that that is what has happened. And so we are continuing to move forward and hopefully be involved in getting this area cleaned up. So next slide, please. So every day that progress isn't made is another day that Yakama Nation tribal members are impacted. And as you see on this slide here, this impacted area, while the most critical advisories for non-consumption relate to resident fish, our resource migrates up into this area. All of our species migrate through this area on their way back to their spawning areas. Even the smolts, when they come down and head out to the ocean, they have to bypass this toxic area. it'd be similar if every day you came to work and you had to drive through toxic fumes. You don't live there, but you are exposed to this danger. And so every day that goes by is another day that our people are being impacted. And so all we want is to have this area cleaned up again, to have a clean river, to have healthy waters for healthy fish. And again, not just only for us, but for our neighbors, and more importantly, for the future generations. So I want to thank Columbia River Keeper for having this opportunity to present the history and what is happening at Bradford Island, and what currently the Yakama Nation are taking steps to get this area effectively cleaned up. So I want to thank again Columbia River Keeper.
Well, thank you so much, Yellowwash and Phil, for joining us today and for sharing both the context, but also the current issues, and importantly, the need for members of the public to step up and get involved, to work in solidarity with Yakama Nation and other tribes that have worked for so long to protect clean water and strong salmon runs. So to that end, I'm sharing in the Q&A a link to Columbia River Keeper's petition. And again, thanks to all of you who RSVP'd, you'll receive a copy of that petition as well in the follow-up email along with the recording. And our asks to you are to take action. It makes a difference. When the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency listed Bradford Island and surrounding waters of the Columbia, one of the reasons that was held out was the strong support from members of the public in the form of letters, comments, petitions to EPA. And that was one of the factors of elevating this site along the Columbia to the attention of folks in DC that ultimately made the decision to add Bradford Island and surrounding waters of the Columbia to the worst of the worst Superfund list. In addition, if you're on social media, if you connect with family and friends over email, please share it out. Share this webinar, share the petition. We need people here in the Pacific Northwest, but around the country, to get involved in this really critical environmental justice issue. With that, we have a little less than 10 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to use the Q&A function if you have any follow-up questions for Yellowwash and Phil. And I've also collected some questions from folks in advance of this webinar. So I'm going to start with some of the questions that are coming in, and then want to make sure we cover some that folks asked in advance. The first question is about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA's involvement. Has the BIA been asked to assist Yakama Nation? Is the first question we have.
That's a very good question. And so because we're dealing with a federal agency, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is within the Department of Interior, so our involvement is with the Department of Defense, which is a separate department. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs has definite authorities and definite ways that they are involved in, and as part of their relationship to the Yakama Nation. But for the most part, we'd be directly with the Department of Defense and the Department of Ecology. And but certainly we've had definite support from tribal nations, and but as far as the BIA being involved, again, they are from a different Department of Interior, but as far as that goes, we're just dealing with the Department of Defense. And
great, thank you so much, and thank you for that question. The next question is one that we get a lot at Columbia Riverkeeper when we talk about the new Superfund site, which is how far downstream and upstream could fish that are impacted by the pollution at the new Superfund site contaminate other fish and wildlife and people.
Well, as you'll see on that slide that Yellow Wash presented, the advisory extends fairly far upstream. I forget the entire length, but it's relatively far and it extends several miles upstream. The no fish advisory or the no consumption advisory around Bradford Island extends roughly up to Cascade Locks. And that is the do not eat advisory. To answer your question, we don't have a good understanding of the extent of the PCBs in fish and in sediment in the river. More investigation is needed to determine that. There's been little studying downstream of the dam. And there's been some questions raised about the reference sample locations too. So the jury's really out on the nature and extent at this point.
Great, thank you. A question that we received in advance of the webinar was if, Yellow Wash, if you could speak at all to, if this area hadn't been polluted by the Army Corps of Engineers or if it had been cleaned up a long time ago, what types of fishing would be happening in the area that is now restricted for fishing? What would, for example, Yakama Nation tribal members be out there trying to catch? And what might they eat and bring home to their families?
Good question. Again, we are, depending on which species are running now, we are aware that there are certain times of the year, certain seasons, where our tribal members would go out and say, get the salmon. There are other species, sockeye, coho. And so it kind of would just depend on the time of year that when these runs occur. And so again, these are migratory, but also at the same time, they're in our ability to sustain ourselves for thousands and thousands of years. Of course, we relied on other other natural foods that come from the river. Mussels, those sorts of things. And so if there was no Bonneville Dam, if there was no Bradford Island, definitely you would see scaffolds on the island. You would definitely see them in that area. Our fishermen know exactly where the best fishing spots were. So that was a very hard decision for the council to make when they issued the emergency closure on Bradford Island, even though we have, through our Supreme Court cases, have the right to exercise our usual and custom gathering places. So yeah, definitely utilizing all what the river provided for us in many ways.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. As we wrap up here in our last couple of minutes, I did want to share with you all, I will pop it into the chat. So Yellow Wash shared that there is this Restoration Advisory Board, or RAB, that is part of the CERCLA process. It was created by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It isn't government-to-government consultation between tribal governments like Yakama Nation or any other tribes and the federal government. It is a forum for members of the public to hear directly from the agencies that are responsible for cleanup and to ask questions and to give input. And so I am sharing information during the webinar and then in the follow-up email. It's really critical to have public involvement at many different levels, including in that forum. So would encourage for those of you who are interested to come and speak up during public comment, or if you want to get more involved, contact Kate at columbiariverkeeper.org. email will be in the follow-up email that we're sending, who's our community organizer, working with folks that are impacted by the new Superfund site, the pollution, the cleanup, as well as people that want to stand in solidarity with the tribe, as well as who care deeply about environmental justice, whether you eat locally caught fish or not. So with that, I think we do have time, it looks like, for maybe one more question. And the question is, could tribal children who are being raised and eating fish from near, up, or downstream from Bradford Island be tracked over time in case they end up with health problems, to assist in their medical needs and et cetera? Is that something, Phil, you might be able to comment on?
I'm not really a toxicologist, so I think I'd be out of my place to really comment on that.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for that question. And what I will say from the work that we've been involved in with Bradford Island cleanup, we are so early in the critical process to get this cleanup jump started and to have questions like that addressed, and to make sure that the studies that need to be in motion are in motion. And right now, our big focus is to get that process started, which begins, as Yellowwash explained, with getting this federal facilities agreement completed. And so that, again, is where we're asking all of our listeners to please consider signing that petition to government officials and share it on your social media networks, over email, and encourage other people to stand in solidarity with Yakama Nation and speak up for environmental justice. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, for giving us your time. And I, of course, especially want to thank Yellowwash and Phil for sharing your insights and expertise with everybody here today, and for everyone who will listen to this recording.